They bricked up that doorway sometime in the last 100 years, and whoever did it really did not want you to know what was on the other side. David had been doing structural assessments for over a decade. He had been inside the basements of courthouses, old hospitals, government buildings that smelled like damp paper and forgotten decisions. He knew what old foundations looked like. He knew the difference between a wall that had always been a wall and a wall that used to be something else. And the moment he pushed that rusted filing cabinet aside on the third subfloor of the Harwick Municipal Records building, he knew he was looking at the second kind. The doorway was there in the stone like a held breath, arched at the top, maybe 2 meters tall and just wide enough for a grown man to walk through without turning sideways. The bricks that filled it were clean, too clean. The surrounding wall was dark limestone that had been sitting in that basement for centuries, sweating moisture and slowly going gray. But the bricks in the doorway were a different color entirely, a warmer, drier tone that did not belong to the same century as anything around them. Someone had filled that arch within the last 100 years, possibly much more recently than that. The mortar between the bricks had not even fully darkened yet. David stood there for a moment in the silence of that subfloor, the hum of a ventilation pipe somewhere above him, the faint smell of old iron and limestone dust in the air, and he took out his phone and photographed it from 4 different angles. Then he finished the rest of the assessment, wrote up his report, and flagged the sealed doorway as a structural anomaly requiring further investigation before any renovation work touched that wall. His supervisor called him the next morning. The call lasted maybe 3 minutes. The message was simple. Log it as a pre-existing non-structural feature, note that it falls outside the scope of the current assessment, and do not include a recommendation for further investigation. The client had already been informed, the supervisor said. There was nothing to follow up on. Move on to the next job. David asked one question. He asked who the client had spoken to about it and when, because he had only submitted his report the evening before, and it was barely 8 in the morning. His supervisor paused for just a fraction of a second too long, and then said that these things get handled quickly when they involve older buildings. That was it. That was the whole explanation. He said fine and hung up, but he did not feel fine. He felt the way you feel when someone answers a question you did not quite ask. The speed of that call bothered him more than the doorway itself. A sealed arch in a basement is unusual. A phone call before 8 in the morning telling you to stop looking at it is something else entirely. He sat with his coffee going cold on the table and thought about his uncle. If you have ever found yourself asking questions that someone really does not want you to finish asking, you will understand exactly what David felt that morning. If this kind of story is what you are here for, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps more than you think, and there is a lot more where this is coming from. His uncle's name was Ray. He had spent most of his working life doing subsurface infrastructure work, the unglamorous side of civil engineering, mapping water mains and drainage systems in old city centers where the ground beneath the streets was never quite what the existing schematics said it should be. Ray had told David this story exactly once, at a family gathering years earlier, in the specific tone of someone sharing something they had mostly decided to stop thinking about. Ray's crew had been rerouting a drainage line in the older part of the city when they hit something their equipment was not supposed to be able to hit. Not a pipe, not a buried foundation. A passage, a real one, with dressed stone walls and a vaulted ceiling and a floor that had been deliberately leveled at some point by human hands. The arch was the same proportions David would later recognize in that Harwick basement, though he did not know that yet when Ray first told him the story. Wide enough to walk through, finished, intentional, pointing in a direction that had nothing to do with the drainage line they were following. Ray had filed a discovery report the same afternoon, standard procedure. Within 48 hours, a man from the city's Heritage and Infrastructure Office had come out to the site, looked at the passage for about 10 minutes, taken some photographs, and told Ray's crew to reroute around it and not include it in the final project documentation. No explanation for the omission. When Ray asked, he was told the passage was already in the historical record and did not require a new entry. Ray checked the historical record when he got home that evening. There was nothing in it even close to what they had found. He assumed for years that it was a one-off, some buried medieval remnant, locally significant, quietly managed by people who knew more about it than he did. He filed it in the part of his memory reserved for things that do not have a clean explanation and slowly stopped bringing it up. But David, sitting at his kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a photograph of a bricked-up archway on his phone, was no longer willing to call it a one-off. Because Ray had found a sealed passage in one city, and David had just found one in another, and in both cases the response from above had been identical, not confused, not curious. Immediate, calm, and completely unreasonable in its speed. 2 engineers, 2 cities, 2 sealed doors, 1 script. The same 4-word administrative label had been used to close down tunnel investigations in at least 11 different countries, and nobody had ever questioned why. David spent the next 3 weeks doing what his supervisor had told him not to do. He was not dramatic about it. He did not quit his job or drive through the night to some archive. He just started reading, carefully and systematically, the way engineers read things, looking for the load-bearing points in an argument and testing whether they actually held weight. He started with publicly available municipal records, heritage databases, academic papers on subsurface archaeology, the kind of material that is technically open to anyone but practically invisible because it lives in the most unvisited corners of institutional websites and regional library catalogs. What he found in the first week was unremarkable on its own. Dozens of documented tunnel discoveries across old city centers, each one logged, each one assessed, each one filed. Standard stuff. But in the second week, he started noticing something that made the back of his neck feel strange, in a way he could not immediately explain. The administrative category used to classify these discoveries, the specific label that effectively ended any further official inquiry, was not just similar across different countries. It was functionally identical. The wording shifted slightly from language to language, the way a phrase shifts when translated by someone who knows what they are doing. But the structure was the same. The effect was the same. And the effect was always this: noted, not requiring further investigation. Case closed. He printed out 7 of these records from 7 different cities and laid them side by side on his kitchen table, the smell of fresh ink mixing with the cold air coming under the back door. He looked at them for a long time. 7 cities, 7 different municipal bureaucracies, 7 different languages underneath the English translations he had pulled, and one shared mechanism for making sure the story stopped where it was. That is not a coincidence. Coincidences have texture, variation, the messy fingerprints of independent people arriving at similar places by different roads. This was smooth. This was the same road taken 7 times and called 7 different names. The thing that hit him hardest was not the label itself, but what the label replaced. In almost every case, there had been a local account of the discovery before the official record absorbed it. A worker who told someone, a site manager who wrote an informal note, a local historian who had heard stories from people whose grandparents had spoken about passages under the old streets. In every single case, that informal layer of memory described something larger than what the official record acknowledged. The workers said the passage kept going. The grandparents said the tunnels ran between towns. The local accounts were specific, physical, grounded in the kind of detail that comes from someone who was actually there and saw something with their own eyes. And in every single case, that layer had been quietly reclassified, not disproved, not investigated and found wanting, just renamed. Moved from the category of physical claim into the category of local legend, regional folklore, unverified oral tradition. Once it was folklore, it stopped being evidence, and nobody had to explain why. David sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about that for a while. Because what had just happened on paper in front of him was a magic trick. A real physical claim, made by real people who touched real stone, had been converted into a story. Not by proving it wrong, just by giving it a different name. And once the name changed, the whole machinery of serious inquiry politely looked away. If you have spent any time trying to get a straight answer from an institution about something it does not want to discuss, you will recognize that trick immediately. It is not aggressive. It is not even dishonest in any way you can easily point to. It is just a door, quietly closed, with a reasonable-sounding sign on the front. David closed his laptop that night and did something he had not done in years. He called his Uncle Ray, not to talk about the tunnel, to ask one specific question. He asked Ray whether the heritage official who had come to his site and told him to reroute had used any particular phrase when explaining why the discovery did not need a new entry in the historical record. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said yes. He said the man had used a phrase that Ray had actually written down at the time because it struck him as oddly formal for a casual conversation. He went and found the old notebook. He read it out. It was the same label, word for word. David had been looking at buildings his whole professional life without really seeing them, and that was exactly the problem. The Harwick Municipal Records Building, the one with the sealed doorway in its third subfloor, had been built on a site that had held a public structure of some kind for as long as anyone had mapped the city. David knew this because it was in the heritage listing, a single dry sentence noting that the plot had been in continuous civic use since the earliest surviving records of the settlement. He had read that sentence a dozen times without it meaning anything. Now it meant something. He started pulling the architectural histories of the oldest buildings in every city where a tunnel discovery had been documented and quietly reclassified. And what he found there was a different kind of problem from the administrative one. This was not a paper trail. This was stone and geometry and the mute stubbornness of physical things that do not change their story depending on who is asking. The buildings were wrong. Not visually wrong, not ugly or obviously out of place. They were wrong in the way that a sentence is wrong when one word has been substituted for another and the grammar still works, but the meaning has shifted somewhere it was not supposed to go. The arch proportions in the oldest structural elements of these buildings matched each other across cities in a way that had no documented explanation. David was not an architectural historian, but he was an engineer, and he understood ratios. He understood that when a structural ratio repeats across buildings that were supposedly designed independently, in different regions, by different builders, working from different traditions, that repetition is not stylistic, it is technical. It means the same calculation was used. And the same calculation means the same source. He pulled every academic paper he could find that addressed this convergence directly. There were not many. The ones that existed acknowledged the similarity and then explained it away with a phrase that David was starting to find very familiar in its structure. They called it a natural convergence of independent solutions to shared structural problems, which sounds reasonable until you actually think about what it is claiming. It is claiming that builders who never met, working in different materials, in different climates, across distances of hundreds of kilometers, all arrived at the same numerical ratio by accident, not approximately the same. The same. David measured it himself in photographs, checking the proportions of archways in 3 different cities against each other. The variance was less than 2%. That is not independent problem solving. That is a shared blueprint. And a shared blueprint means a shared origin. Something coordinated this. And whatever it was, it had been so thoroughly removed from the record that the only trace left was the geometry itself, sitting in the stone, waiting for someone who knew how to read it. The ground floors of the oldest buildings in every city David visited were sinking, not slowly, not gradually, not in the way that centuries of foot traffic and resurfacing gently raises a street. They were buried, deliberately, completely, and all at roughly the same depth. He had not planned to visit any of these cities in person. The research had been going well enough from his desk, pulling photographs and architectural records and heritage survey reports. But there is a difference between looking at a photograph of a half-buried window and standing in front of one. And David needed to stand in front of one. So he booked 3 trips over the course of 6 weeks, kept them short, told his partner he was following up on a work lead, which was not entirely untrue, and went. The first city hit him harder than he expected. He had picked a street in the oldest quarter, a long row of civic buildings from what the heritage listings called the early period of the settlement. He walked it on a gray morning with cold air sitting flat and heavy on everything, the smell of old stone and wet pavement, the sound of his own footsteps not quite echoing right in the narrow space between the buildings. And then he stopped, because the window in front of him, a tall, arched window that had clearly been designed as a full ground floor opening, the kind of window you put in a room where you want light and air and a view of the street, was sitting with its lower edge below the level of the pavement, not slightly below, fully below. The bottom third of the window frame was underground, visible only because someone had dug a narrow trench around it to keep the earth and rainwater back. He crouched down and looked at it. The stone around the frame was the same age as the wall. The trench was much newer. Someone had dug the trench to save the window from disappearing entirely, which meant, at some point, the window had been in the process of disappearing entirely. He saw the same thing in the second city, and the third. Different buildings, different streets, different architectural styles, same depth, same proportion of buried to visible. Same narrow trenches dug by later hands to keep the earth from swallowing the lower story completely. In his notebook, he wrote a single line after the third city. He wrote, "This is not accumulation. This is coverage. The distinction matters. Accumulation is what happens when a street rises by a few centimeters every generation, because roads get resurfaced and debris settles, and life piles up slowly on itself. It is uneven, organic, different on one side of a street than the other. What David was looking at was none of those things. It was even. It was consistent across buildings that faced different directions and sat on different geological substrates. It covered an entire district at the same depth, the way a tide covers a shore, not the way decades of resurfacing covers a road. Something had come down on these cities and covered their lower stories in a single movement. And the underground network that ran beneath those lower stories had been directly in the path of whatever it was. He thought about the plugs. In several of the discovery reports he had read, the engineers who followed a promising passage until it stopped described not a wall, but a mass of compacted earth. Dense, dry, packed so tightly it had essentially become part of the surrounding ground. Not a cave-in, not a collapse of the passage ceiling, but a fill, as if the passage had been full of liquid or loose material that then dried and hardened in place. He had not understood the significance of that detail when he first read it. Standing in that third city with the buried windows in front of him, he understood it now. The same event that covered the ground floors covered the tunnels, from above and below at the same moment. A single movement that buried everything below a certain depth and then stopped, leaving the upper stories of the building standing in the open air, slightly bewildered, like a person who has walked out of water and is still dripping. The official explanation for the buried windows was gradual street-level rise. David had checked the geology, the historical resurfacing records, the rate of sediment accumulation specific to each region. The numbers did not work, not even close. The burial depth required centuries more gradual rise than the age of the buildings allowed. The math was not slightly off, it was completely wrong. And nobody in any official record had ever pointed this out, which was itself the strangest part of the whole thing. If you walk past a building with a window below the pavement every day for your whole life, you stop seeing it. It becomes part of the texture of the city, normal because it is familiar. That is how the most important evidence disappears. Not because anyone removes it, because everyone stops looking at it. David flew home from the third city and sat in the airport for 2 hours before his flight, looking at his notebook and thinking about two separate mechanisms arriving at the same result. And that was when the picture shifted into something colder and more specific than anything he had considered before. The plugs in the tunnels were not all the same. That was the detail David had almost missed because it was buried in a footnote in one of the subsurface archaeology papers he had read during the first week of research. He had noted it at the time and then moved on, not knowing what to do with it. Now he went back to it. The paper described two distinct types of obstruction found in old underground passages. The first type was natural fill, compacted sediment with organic material mixed in. The kind of thing that happens when water-carried earth slowly settles into a space over a long period, or rapidly, if enough water moves through at once. The second type was different. It was dry, mortared, deliberately shaped to fit the profile of the passage it was blocking, and it contained no organic material at all. It was, in the language of the paper, a constructed obstruction, a seal, built to stop something, not a result of something happening. The paper had noted this distinction, acknowledged that the constructed obstructions appeared to post-date the natural fill in every case where both were present in the same passage, and then moved on without drawing the conclusion that was sitting right there in the data. David drew it. The sequence was visible once you looked. First, the natural event, whatever it was, filled the lower portions of the passages with sediment and choked the connecting stretches between cities. Then, at some later point, human hands came in and finished the job. They sealed the upper portions that the sediment had not reached. They bricked the doorways. They made sure that even if someone dug through the natural fill and found the passage again, they would hit a constructed wall before they found anything worth knowing. 2 phases, 2 mechanisms, 1 result. The event broke the spine of the network. The ceiling made sure it stayed broken. And the gap between them, the time between the natural catastrophe and the human response, was long enough that the people doing the sealing may not have fully understood what they were sealing. They may have known only that the passages existed, that they ran in directions that were inconvenient. and that closing them was the right decision for reasons that had already been decided by someone above them. The decision itself had been made earlier by people who did understand. The workers who laid the bricks were just following instructions that had come down through enough layers that the original reasoning had been lost somewhere in the middle. That thought kept David awake for most of the night after he got home, because it meant the ceiling was not necessarily a single organized conspiracy. It was something more durable than that. It was a policy. And policies do not need everyone involved to understand them. They just need everyone involved to follow them. The people who maintained the network never wrote anything down, not because they were careless, because they were trained from the beginning to treat written records as the most dangerous thing they could leave behind. David found this out not from an archive but from a single paragraph in a guild history published by a small regional press, the kind of book that gets printed in a run of a few hundred copies and ends up in the back shelves of specialist libraries where nobody under 60 ever goes. He had been following a footnote from one of the subsurface archaeology papers, which led to another footnote in a municipal engineering history, which led eventually to this book. The paragraph was almost offhand, tucked between a description of a medieval water guild's membership structure and a note about their fee schedule. It said that members were required upon initiation to swear an oral oath, never written, never witnessed by outsiders, covering the location and condition of all subsurface infrastructure under their maintenance. It said the oath included a specific prohibition against committing that information to paper under any circumstances. And it said this practice was not unique to this guild, but was documented in similar form in at least 6 other regional guilds across different parts of the continent. David read that paragraph 4 times. Then he sat back and thought about what it meant for the absence of records. Because the standard historical argument against a connected underground network is simple. If it existed, someone would have written it down. There would be maps, maintenance logs, construction records, and there are none. Therefore, it did not exist. That argument sounds solid. It sounds like logic, but it only works if the people involved wanted a paper trail. These people specifically did not. The absence of records was not an accident of history or a loss through fire or flood. It was policy. The silence was built into the structure of the organization from the start. And once you understand that, the absence of documentation stops being evidence against the network and becomes evidence of exactly how seriously the people who ran it took the need to keep it invisible. He started pulling references to similar guild structures in other regions, and the pattern held. Different names, different centuries, different crafts used as cover for the actual function. Some were associated with stonework, some with water management, some with what the records vaguely called civic maintenance. But in each case, the same core features appeared: oral transmission of technical knowledge, no written maps, strict internal hierarchy, and a prohibition, always framed as sacred rather than merely practical, against revealing the location of what they maintained to anyone outside the membership. The sacred framing was not decoration, it was the mechanism. When you tell a person that breaking a rule will damage their soul, you get better compliance than when you tell them it will damage their career. The guilds understood that. They built their silence to last longer than any individual member's lifetime. And then the catastrophe came. Whatever it was and however it moved, it did not leave the guilds intact. The evidence for this was in what came after, in the gap between the natural fill David had identified in the tunnel records and the constructed seals that followed it. That gap was not a few years. Based on the materials used in the constructed obstructions, the mortar compositions, the brick types, it was closer to a generation, maybe 2, long enough that the people doing the sealing were working from incomplete knowledge. They knew the passages existed. They may have known roughly where some of them ran, but the detailed maps, the full routes, the connecting points between cities, all of that had lived only in the heads of guild members who were no longer there to share it. The sealing was thorough where the new authorities had direct access and fragmentary where they did not, which is exactly the pattern David found when he mapped the documented discoveries against each other. Dense sealing near city centers, increasingly rough and inconsistent work as the passages moved outward toward the routes between cities. The people doing the sealing were working blind in the outer sections, guessing at where the passages ran, sealing what they could find and missing what they could not. The network was not destroyed cleanly. It was damaged, abandoned, and then partially sealed by people who did not fully understand what they were sealing. That was the inheritance. That was what had been sitting under every old city ever since, intact in the places nobody had reached, choked with sediment in the sections the catastrophe had filled, and bricked at the doorways by hands that had followed a policy without fully knowing its origins. David wrote all of this up in a document he kept on an encrypted drive. Not because he thought anyone was watching him, just because the habit of documentation felt important now in a way it had not felt before. He had spent weeks thinking about what it meant to have no written record, and the instinct to make one had become almost physical, a need to put the shape of the thing on paper before it slipped back into the category of unverifiable impression. The map David built over the following 2 weeks was not dramatic to look at. It was a simple overlay, the kind of thing any GIS software could produce, with 2 datasets plotted on top of each other across a base map of the continent. The first dataset was the documented tunnel discoveries, the ones he had pulled from municipal records, heritage databases, and subsurface archaeology reports. The second was the locations of the oldest major civic and religious structures in each city, the buildings with the anomalous arch proportions, the ones built to the shared template that had no documented origin. When he ran the overlay, he stared at the screen for a long time without moving. The tunnels did not run randomly. He had suspected this, but had not been prepared for how clean the pattern would look when it was actually plotted. The documented discovery points, scattered across more than a dozen cities, formed a network of lines when you connected them in the order that made geographic sense, and those lines ran directly beneath the oldest major buildings in each city, not near them, not in the general neighborhood. Directly beneath them, within margins that were too tight to be coincidental, given the distances involved. The buildings were not sitting near the tunnels by chance. They had been placed on top of them. The tunnel routes had come first, and the buildings had been built at the points where the routes converged, which meant the buildings were not just buildings. They were markers. They were the surface expression of something underground, placed at the nodes of a network to mark the access points, the way a lighthouse marks a harbor entrance. The architecture above was the signal. The infrastructure below was the purpose. And whoever built both of them had thought of them as one system, not two. David zoomed out on the map until the whole continent was visible. The lines between the documented discovery points, extended in the directions the passages had been running when they were found, did not terminate at city limits. They pointed outward. They pointed toward each other. And in the spaces between cities, in the regions where no discovery had been documented, the soil composition maps he had overlaid showed exactly the kind of soft limestone and natural cave-bearing geology that would have made long-distance passage construction possible without extraordinary effort. The landscape between the cities was not solid rock. It was, in many stretches, almost asking to be tunneled. He saved the map and closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of his study with the particular feeling of someone who has just seen the shape of something enormous for the first time. Not excitement, exactly. Something more serious than that. The map was not proof, but it was the kind of picture that, once you had seen it, made the official explanation feel like a drawing someone had made of a completely different thing and insisted was the same. And he had not yet found the most important piece. That was still 2 weeks away, in a conversation he did not know he was about to have. Graham had spent 40 years working beneath the streets of one of the oldest cities on the continent, and when David finally sat across from him at a small kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold between them, the first thing Graham said was that he had been waiting for someone to ask, not expecting, waiting. There is a difference, and Graham made it clear with the particular tone of a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and had quietly accepted that he would probably carry it to the end. He was in his 80s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of stillness that comes from decades of working in confined spaces where sudden movements are expensive. His hands were flat on the table. He did not fidget once during the entire conversation. David had found him through a retired engineers network, following a name that appeared in the acknowledgments of one of the subsurface papers he had read early in his research. Just a name, no context, no explanation for why it was there. He had sent a letter, an actual paper letter, because he could not find a working email address, and Graham had replied within a week, with a phone number and a time to call. The call lasted 4 minutes. Graham gave him an address and said, "Come on a Tuesday. Mornings are better." The kitchen smelled of old wood and something faintly metallic that David could not identify and did not ask about. Outside the window, a garden in the slow process of being reclaimed by itself. Graham waited until David had his recorder on the table, looked at it without objecting, and started talking. He said that in his third year on the job, his crew had broken through into a passage during a routine utilities upgrade. Dressed stone, vaulted ceiling, level floor. He described it in the same terms David had heard from every other source, but with the specific texture of someone who had been there physically, the cold air that came out of it when the wall broke, the way the sound changed in the space beyond, the smell of stone that had been sealed for a very long time. He had filed a report. The response came back within 24 hours. Reroute. Do not document the find in the project record. Use the standard category in the internal log. He named the category. It was the same one David had found in 11 other countries, word for word. David asked him how many times something like that happened over his career. Graham thought for a moment. He said not often, maybe once every several years, but always the same response, always the same category, always the same instruction to reroute and move on. He said after the first 2 or 3 times he stopped being surprised. It became part of the job the way other inconvenient things become part of a job. You learn the shape of what you are not supposed to do, and you work around it. Nobody sat him down and explained the policy. Nobody needed to. The instruction was clear enough that the reasoning behind it felt like someone else's business. David asked the question he had been building toward for the entire conversation. He asked whether Graham had ever been told, directly or indirectly, what the passages were or where they led. Graham picked up his cup, looked into it, put it back down. He said no. He said that was the thing that stayed with him. Not the passages themselves, not the instructions, but the absence of curiosity from above. Every manager he had ever reported a find to had responded with the same practiced calm. No surprise, no interest, no follow-up questions, just the instruction. As if the existence of the passages was already fully understood by someone higher up, and the only job of the people in the middle was to make sure the information traveled no further down. The people below found things. The people above already knew. And the layer in between just made sure the two never had a proper conversation about it. David drove home from that meeting with the window down despite the cold, needing the air and the noise of the road. Because what Graham had described was not a conspiracy in the way people picture conspiracies, dramatic and coordinated and driven by a clear purpose. It was something more ordinary and more durable. It was an institutional reflex, a behavior so well established that it no longer needed anyone to actively maintain it. The people in the middle were not covering anything up. They were just doing their jobs in the shape that the job had always had. The cover was structural. It was load-bearing. And load-bearing things do not fall down when one person decides to stop believing in them. He sat with that thought for most of the drive, and by the time he pulled into his street, he had understood something that changed the shape of everything that came before it. He went inside, opened his laptop, pulled up the map he had built, and looked at it with fresh eyes, not as a conspiracy map, as a diagram of a system. A system that had been broken once by something large and natural, patched imperfectly by people who did not fully understand what they were patching, and then maintained in its broken state by nothing more dramatic than routine, normal procedures, standard categories. The instruction to reroute and move on passed from one generation of managers to the next until nobody alive remembered why the instruction existed in the first place. That is the thing about the tunnels. That is the thing David kept coming back to in the weeks after he spoke with Graham. Sitting at his desk with the map open and the photographs from the 3 cities pinned to the wall beside it, the buried windows, the sealed doorways, the arch proportions that matched across distances no independent builder could explain. The evidence was not hidden in a vault somewhere. It was not locked behind clearances or buried in classified files. It was in public databases, municipal records, heritage listings, the back shelves of specialist libraries. It was in footnotes. It was in the gap between what a building looked like and what the record said it should cost to build. It was in the soil composition maps that showed soft limestone running in exactly the right directions between exactly the right cities. It was in the uniform depth of burial across streets that should have risen unevenly if the official explanation were true. Every single piece of it was available to anyone who wanted to look. The problem was never access. The problem was that nobody looked, because looking had never been encouraged, and not being encouraged is almost as effective as being forbidden, and far less likely to make someone curious about why. David thought about the sealed door in the Harwick basement, the one where this had all started. The phone call at 8 in the morning. The supervisor's voice, flat and practiced, delivering an instruction that had probably passed through 20 sets of hands before it reached him, each pair of hands holding it briefly and passing it on without asking where it came from. The instruction was old. Older than the supervisor. Older probably than the building. It had been traveling through the institution for so long that nobody inside it experienced it as a choice anymore. It was just what you did when you found a sealed passage. You logged it under the standard category and you moved on. And that, David realized, was the actual shape of how the largest things stay hidden, not through force, not through active suppression that someone has to maintain with effort and intention, through habit, through the slow, bureaucratic sedimentation of a decision made once, long ago, by people with a specific reason, which then became a procedure, which then became a reflex, which then became invisible because reflexes always do. The sealed door in Harwick was not being guarded. It was just being ignored in a very organized way by people who had never once been given a reason to do otherwise. The tunnels are still there. The buried windows are still there. The arch ratios are still there in the stone, quiet and patient and completely indifferent to whether anyone reads them correctly. The map David built is still on his encrypted drive, not proof, not a closed case, but a shape. A coherent shape that fits the physical evidence in a way the official account simply does not. 3 lines of evidence pointing at the same thing: the buildings, the passages, and the behavior of every institution that has ever encountered either. None of them individually conclusive. All of them together describing something that is very difficult to explain as coincidence. The moral of all of this is not that someone is lying to you. It is something quieter and harder to argue with than that. It is that the most effective way to keep something unknown is not to hide it, but to make looking for it feel unnecessary. Build the habit of not looking deeply enough into the institutions that manage the information. Give the absence of curiosity a procedural shape, and within a few generations, you do not need anyone actively maintaining the silence. The silence maintains itself. That is what David found underneath the official record, not a locked door with a guard in front of it. A door that everyone had simply agreed, without discussing it, was not worth opening. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If the passages under your city were found tomorrow, opened up, mapped, and shown to connect to the next city along routes that nobody in any official record had ever acknowledged, what do you think the first official statement would say? Think about that carefully and leave your answer below, because I genuinely want to know what you think that statement would look like. If this story made you think, if it made you look at the street outside your window slightly differently than you did an hour ago, leave a like and subscribe. There is more to dig into, and the next thing we look at goes even further beneath the surface than this one did.